welcome back to the Fret Buzz Podcast, Episode 1. I am really excited to share with you guys our conversation. This is a really good one. I'm really enjoying this. And there's a lot of cool stuff coming in the future, so please stay tuned. We're just getting our feet wet. This is going to be a wonderful ride. So by all means, let's jump in.
So basically, this has been something I've been reading a lot, and from a lot of, I would say it's a lot of professional musicians. There seems to be, this kind of battle, especially, on the internet, regarding like what is the best way to kind of really teach instruments like we play, because I don't know what it is about our profession, but it seems like, I think because we play these really popular string instruments, the tendency is by students, I'm sure you guys could agree, is to fall into the trap of just getting focused in on, can I master my instrument? Can I master my technique, right? I mean, it certainly was the case for me as a student. There were so many years where, and I'm sure Aaron remembers these days when we used to play in the band together, I would just be frustrated over not being able to do certain licks, and not being able to do certain techniques and runs the right way. And it was much later when I started realizing that, it's not really about this kind of thing. It's about sort of what's coming out of my fingers, and sort of the musicality of the licks I'm kind of trying to create. So this debate is going back and forth. I've seen a lot of as regarding like, how should we teach our students? Should we get them more into being, technicians, or do we train them to kind of be more of like these musicians, just having like a strong musicianship? So the music only thing that is kind of floating out there is this approach where basically you have students really learn the instruments on their own. So you get a student coming in, and for the first couple of years, there's a lot of instruction that's required. But after a certain point, it's almost just saying like, you go and explore and learn to play, And once you kind of learn to play, then the real training comes in, where you start teaching them about music, and music being sort of like a language or a theory that you can start applying then to what you learn. So the idea is that, let's say I had a studio where I had maybe 50 students. Only a small percentage of them needed to be guitar players. It's not required anymore. The other ones can be pianists, they can be vocalists, they can be, flautists, whomever, right? They come in, and my instruction is music only, which they can actually apply to their respective instruments. So that's kind of like the basics of the theory. I kind of like it. I think the older I get in music education, I see a need for that, because I think, especially for guitar players, I'm not sure what it is about us, but we tend to really just dive in to our technical traps. I don't know. Would you guys agree with that? Or
yeah, I think. Well, go ahead. I think that what you're saying is, I completely agree with it. But I was going to disagree and say that, at least when I was at George Mason, I felt like the guitarists and the pianists, the instrumentalists who played chordal instruments, had a much better understanding of music theory in all the music theory classes and everything, because we actually played chords and learned how to change the chords, change the notes within the chords. And it was the single note instruments that really hadn't taken the time to learn music on a deeper level.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that makes sense. I would agree with that. I think that on a non-college level, for us private teachers who have kids coming in, teenagers and even the young ones, I think I agree with that wholeheartedly. Yes, I think I think that with the internet, it's very easy to be able to go and look up anything and learn how to play and be able to kind of technically feel out your instrument, especially guitar, because it seems as though guitarists are very pattern oriented, very lick oriented. This kind of approach where we just kind of pick up our instrument and just kind of play, which is extremely important. But in terms of them applying the overall music end of it, I would agree that that's not as much.
Well, it's like, okay, so I might get some flack from what I'm about to say, but I'm gonna go ahead and say it. Okay. I have found that over the years, watching people play live, and thinking about, all right, they're sort of in a musical environment where there's progressions going on and certain harmonies are being tonicized and things like that. And they get into a solo space. And the first thing they do, guitar players do this a lot. First thing they do, what do they do? Hit a pentatonic form. They start jamming in pentatonic mode. My question is, why does it always have to be in that particular line of thinking? You know, like I would much be interested in watching a guitarist get up on stage and trying something really unique, you know, within that kind of space, or paying attention to, you know, suggestions of the harmonies that are not really there at first, and try and do some things that maybe are out of the box. For me, I'm into that. And I think guitar players, because of what you said, because of the way we train, and we're pattern-driven players, especially in sort of the rock idiom, we're not thinking about harmony. We're thinking about the lick, right? We're thinking about sort of how our hands are moving. I know I do it. You know, I start getting into a solo sometimes. The first thing I'll do, third finger slide, 14th fret if I'm playing in E position, right? I'm like, why the hell do I keep doing that same move to start a solo?
It's true. It's true. It's absolutely true.
You know, and the next thing I'll follow up with be like a movement of a fifth, and you know, it's like I can almost tell where my patterns are going, and I have to fight that all the time.
Yeah, you can almost predict what you're going to do, and it usually isn't until a certain amount of time into your lick where, quote unquote, you start feeling comfortable with what you do. Do you feel a point where you're kind of like, okay, I'm bored with what I've been doing because I do it all the time. Now, you know, a certain period of time, now it's okay for me to kind of start exploring. Why don't we start that process right away where we just jump into a point where we're like, you know what, I'm going to approach this completely different and just stay away from what I usually do. That's hard to do because you never really know. I think a lot of the times you're thinking about technically what you're doing on the fretboard versus kind of just letting it all go and kind of saying, okay, musically, what's going to come out of my fingers? What am I shooting for once I hit that first note, wherever it is? Where can that lead me? Versus, okay, this first note, well, I have to stay within this pattern, or I have to hit this next note, or this leading tone, and this passing tone, or whatever it is. I think as a guitarist especially, we're just kind of in that mind frame of I've learned my patterns and now I have to kind of stick to them, and how do I make sure that I sound like I'm in key and blah, 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 blah. I don't want to hit a wrong note.
Well, you know, go ahead.
Well, this is where your music only approach actually fixes this problem, I think. If you understand your harmony, and you're much more harmony driven in your thought process, then you are going to think about hitting notes purposefully within the chords that are being played at the time, or notes that clash against the chords on purpose to create some tension and release. But you have to understand your harmony. You can't spend all your time practicing pentatonic licks and then expect to go and improvise and expect something else to come out.
So I guess the question is, like, why do you think that it happens a lot? Do you think it's just guitar players? Because I mean, I'm sure the people who are going to be listening to this will be, you know, players who want to gain knowledge and perspective about their instruments, right? And I know every guitar player I've worked with over the last 30 years or so have fallen into this trap of like patternizing, you know, their stuff and getting through it. So the question is, you know, I think, how essential is it to really understand harmony? Do we need to have it in there? My feeling is, yeah. I think it's everything. One of the greatest lessons I learned from Paul Barsom, right, when I was doing music comp, and he said this to me on day one when I was working as a comp student, and I always thought about this, and I think guitar players don't do this enough. We don't audiate first. You know, we just play. And I think when I really started to think about, okay, I want to hear in my head what I want to say on the instrument and then play that. That to me had tremendous impact on how my playing started to develop. So I remember I just taught a lesson on this a couple of weeks back where I told a student, look, what you want to do, instead of thinking like vertically on your neck, think horizontally, think per string. Play an entire passage on a singular string. Take a note and audiate the next pitch before you play it. Try to hear what a whole step sounds like before you play it. Do the same thing with a minor third or a major third, and try to make a pattern just from audiating on a single string and play that way. And you could see the gears turning, but you know the outcome was going to be that in a musical situation, eventually they could hear a phrase. And I think that's what we don't do. I think guitar players just don't hear it first. I think we just play it.
Yeah, Jimmy used to do that a lot, where he'd actually sing the line and he'd actually play along with it. I think that's extremely important. I do, and you can start to hear intervals better, and you can start to kind of hear where your line is going to go. You're not guessing as much with that kind of idea of, well, I'm going to play a note, and the next note is just going to be what it is, versus, like you're saying, kind of playing a note and saying, okay, well, I'm hearing where I'm hearing all the possibilities where I can go. Do I want to go up a third? Do I want to kind of shift into a fifth? Do I want to go beyond that? Do I want to add a seventh to that? And hearing that in your head before you go to it. And I think, especially, it's always been this way, but especially for rock players. And I tell this to my students all the time, that silence is golden. And things that are slower at a mid tempo or a slow tempo is so important, because I think there's just, amongst rock players, there's this urgency to play like 16th notes all the time and play as fast as you can, and look at my licks, man, I'm so fast and I'm so cool, where it's like they're not giving themselves the time to kind of think about their phrasing and being able to let the note actually sing and kind of hear how that's being pulled from a chord or off of a chord. Or I really think that a lot of people these days just don't kind of let the instrument breathe and speak for itself. That I'm finding that more and more and more. I'm just like, man, just although I do understand, really fast, to want to play really fast, I get it. But at the same time, also know that there's this whole other side of playing any instrument where you can just kind of hold a note, and the power of a whole note or a half note within any kind of passage. And that note is going to hold so much water. There's so much information in that one note, and how it's going to bounce off the frequencies of the other chords that are going on within the band situation.
That's interesting too. I think what you said is important. The fact that, in any kind of phrase or a note, there is information that's carried musically with that. Think about, let's go to the flip side of that for a second. Yngwie. Okay. We've seen him live, right?
Yeah.
And we grew up listening to those guys. And I remember when he was really, prominent in the 80s, people would give him flack for playing too fast and too much stuff, right? But when I listen to his stuff now, I think about it, there's like a lot of information flying by. But it's neat that after a while, your ears be kind of accustomed to the flurry of phrases. And in a sense, it's almost like what he's creating in that space has musicality as well. So it's neat that I think you can play a lot in a small space, you can play a little in a small space, but I think it's a matter of like how you structure everything. How, I'm sure you guys remember, you think about like contour of lines, right? How you hit sort of a contour to your phrasing, and just making it something that you kind of hear first and express first. Scott Henderson, we've talked about many times, right? One of the best lessons I've ever watched him do was one of his earlier videos where he talked about, lines on the guitar being like musical sentences that you kind of repeat a pattern a couple of times, but every time you repeat it, put a new inflection on it, and think about, sort of the rhythms behind it, the contour of the line behind it. So it's neat. I think how you hear should translate to, how we express. But again, it gets back to the fact that I don't think we're training our students that way. I think our students are coming in to lessons, and they're I think the major concern with them is, can I play? So for me, I think the music only thing, it's neat. I'm not sure how you guys feel about this, but I think it's something that I'm not sure. I haven't worked this out myself. Should we start training students to hear musical harmonies and musical ideas early, or is it something after they've gotten through the quote unquote mastery of their instrument phase? Because it seems a lot of the earlier players are kind of concerned with.
Although I do think that the technicality of being able to play your instrument is extremely important. And personally, that's what I do. I try to get my students technically at least able to, because I find that if it's an overload of information, where if they're thinking too much about their technique, they're not actually thinking about what we're talking about at musicality theory wise or anything like that. They can't, there's no way for them to do that. So I tried personally to try to get their technique up to par, and then I start introducing more. And I mean, I'll definitely introduce small bits of information of theory and musicality, but for the most part, it's technique at first so they can get it under their fingers. And then that way, once we start talking about concepts, they're no longer thinking about their technique. If they are, it's very little, but they're not thinking about that as much.
I think with piano players, it's easier to start doing some of this earlier because the technique it's not nearly as difficult to get a good sound out of the instrument. You know, you can have a 6-year-old play a note on the piano and it sounds just as good as my note. All they have to do is push down on the key.
Question for you guys: how often do you guys, if you're teaching a guitar player, how often do you introduce other instruments into their lesson?
You mean as far as like examples for things? So here's what an oboe would do if they were to play the same line, that kind of thing, or actually teach them other instruments?
Just how another musician would approach something, or let's just say the piano. And so, because I find that with guitarists, they have a hard time understanding certain concepts. Whereas if I take them over to the piano, let's say, and just kind of play it so they can visually see what's going on, there's like this light bulb that happens really quick. Whereas if I were to just stay on the guitar, that doesn't happen as fast or as often.
Well, okay, I'm going to say this, and this goes out to all you youngins out there. I'm pointing the invisible space, so I hope you're listening to me. So I kind of know what I'm talking about. I don't know a lot, but I know this. Learn music, and you can play almost anything, instrument-wise. Okay, I mean, with reason, all right? I mean, we're not going to master, other instruments we don't practice on, but I mean, think about it. How many times have you guys even done this, where you picked up a banjo off the wall, or a mandolin, and once you kind of learn the tuning, within half an hour, you're playing something on it. So I think it's really important that we not only, teach students other instruments and how they work, but yes, teach them about how other musicians within those disciplines will approach a lick, and going back to phrasing and how phrasing is kind of important, how, let's say, how a pianist, right, would, hit a phrase, I mean, if you think about blues licks, sort of the blues notes of the pentatonic scale are the same whether you're playing guitar, you're playing bass, you're playing piano, but depending on what respective instrument you have, you touch it a different way, right? So I think it's important to bring those into the conversation really early. And you guys know, like, the students who are willing to go there with you. How many times we had in our studio students who would say, how does this work? And we're like, well, bring it to the keyboard, check this out, here's how you would do it here. So I think it is important that we sort of expose them to many instruments early. I've mentioned this before with my daughter, who I'm trying to get into guitar now. I'm really reticent about just saying, be a guitar player, because I know better. I know that if she learns what music is and how music works, she can range out and be a multi-instrumentalist. And I think that's kind of, for me, really fascinating nowadays. You can actually have a wide range of instruments you can draw from, especially if you're a composer. If you want to write music, you have to learn how those instruments operate to write for them, right? So you're going to orchestrate. So that's a really big part of our educational process.
If we were to introduce and make, or at least suggest to students that they play both the piano and the guitar, I think that everyone would benefit so much, because I mean, I grew up playing the piano when I was a kid, and I switched to guitar in high school. And I see the piano when I play the guitar. And
that's interesting. That's really interesting.
It's really helpful. But then I've taken the guitar so much further that now when I go back to the piano, when I try to play like a blues lick on the piano, I see it on the guitar. And I think it is really useful to see the same lick on two different instruments. You start to really understand the lick. There's some things that I had been playing on the guitar for years, like bluesy sounding licks, and I took them to the piano. I was like, oh, this makes a lot more sense. Well, and now I can use that. I changed it up on the guitar based on what I learned from the piano. And I think that learning the two instruments, I mean, you play the piano, and if you're playing chords, it's so much easier to see like sus chords and how notes are moving within the chords. And then you go back to the guitar, and it's just much easier to do that effectively on the guitar if you've seen it on the piano.
Yeah. See, I'm the other way. It's interesting you said it. I think in guitar, at least I think in guitar. I like to think that I can kind of break away from that nowadays, but I think sort of where my approach now is as a teacher is I don't want to think in any instrument. I want to be able to think in terms of how I hear. so I can apply it to multi instruments. But yes, at its core, like I grew up a guitarist. That was really my first kind of training. So when I sort of think of the musical lines in the recesses of my brain, I'm watching my fingers on the strings play the lick.
Yeah,
makes sense.
It's good to have multiple different ways to do it yourself. I mean,
you want to hear something funny? Well, I can memorize strings and numbers. I can memorize a phone number. I'll memorize it on a string. That's how I do it. My wife always says to me, like, how did you memorize that number? I'm watching my hands play the frets as the digits, and I can just remember. It's just stupid, but it goes to show you how we process information, and especially as musicians, how we do it. And maybe in that lies some of the issue with guitarists, that we tend to over rely on the tactile, feedback we're getting from our hands and not really translating. Yeah, I know certainly as a musician, that's what plagued me for many years, and it still does. If I hit my Ableton program on, let's say, and I want to create like a loop pattern or something, I want to lay a lick down, I find myself repeating a lot of things and going a lot of spaces when I should really be listening first. And then tracking, and then kind of recreating from what I'm hearing, so the earlier we can kind of do that with our students, I think just the better off musically they're going to be. I feel.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I think that we should go back to the teaching of harmony in order to, teaching musicality in general in order to make you better at your instrument. I want to go back to, it could be in terms of improvisation or in terms of songwriting, but I think that learning chords is like the most important thing you can do. I mean, you need to understand your melody to an extent, but if we could teach our kids chords, and if instead of teaching the pentatonic box as the first thing that we teach young guitarists, if we made them play arpeggios over the chords as they're passing, and later on bring in that pentatonic box to help them, but if they understood what notes are going to resonate with the chord, then later on they can choose to land on those notes, to start on those notes, to land on those notes, to land on notes outside of the chord, to create a specific type of sound on purpose. I think that just starting them out like that might produce a better result in the end.
Sure. I think to a degree, because the other thing I've found over the years is that guitarists love chord scale relationships. Big term, and I think it's another kind of crutch that we get to. So, for instance, if we have this harmony running here, I know I can run these modes and attach them, and they'll work all the time, right? As I mentioned in the last podcast, with sometimes you break the rules with the D major over a D minor scale. They kind of work together. But at that same time, I don't think we're listening then. I think what we're doing is just matching, chord, scale, put them together, and kind of see what comes out. That's fine as long as we're paying attention to how the tones are interacting. And I don't think students do that. Sometimes I don't think players even do that. They might hear the effects of putting those two things together, but they're not listening internally. They're not breaking down the innards of those interactions. For me, it's a lot like chemistry. You're mixing things together and looking at the reactions that kind of come out of there. It's interesting. I have a student in my day job. I teach also literature. I'm sure I've mentioned to you guys. And I have a student this past school year said to me, he said, I really want to be a songwriter. What should I do? And I said, what do you mean? He's like, well, I want to go to school for it. I said, I don't think you need to go to school for songwriting. But I said, you need to start writing songs. It's really that simple. How to become a great writer? By writing. It's not hard to do that. And I said, how much music do you know? And he goes, I know very little. I said, well, here's what you need to do. As Joe even alluded to, learn harmony. That's it. Learn harmony. Learn how chords mix together. Learn how chord changes sound in certain effects, and then learn to write, around those kind of changes. And I remember a couple of weeks later, he came back and he said, yeah, I don't really understand what I'm doing yet, but I've tried a couple of things on my piano, and I liked what I had, and actually produced a couple of lines of lyrics. Okay, great. There's kind of the start for that, at least in terms of a writing process. But again, going back to us as guitar players, I remember, being a kid, not understanding how certain songwriters did what they did. And I said, all right, well, I'll just kind of know that over this A minor chord, I'll play in, an Aeolian scale, or and I can change it to harmonic minor and get this sound. But again, I'm not listening internally. I'm kind of hearing an effect of matching that pattern.
Yeah.
I think one of the coolest things I've done recently, I was on an airplane ride and I decided I was going to write a song on the airplane. And so I actually wrote a melody down on paper and just kind of hearing it in my head. And then I put chords to that to fit the melody. And then I tried changing up, changing keys and 2/5ing my way into different keys. And it was a really interesting, I actually really liked the song. There were a couple things I would change, but I think if you were to have a student looking into songwriting, you could have them, a lot of times before I would just put some chords together and, I'm in the key of C major. I have these diatonic chords I can use. But maybe try a song that way, try a song writing a melody within that key and then adding chords to fit that, to fit your melody, and then try to modify it to, if you want to change keys or go somewhere jazzier with it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, think about like all the old guys, Beethoven, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially when he was at the earlier or later part of his life when his hearing was going. How did he do it? How did he write the Ninth Symphony with hearing loss? He audiated, right? It was on paper. He knew that certain things, as you mentioned, you can write a melody and hear it in your head. You know what kind of harmonies are there. Interestingly, Arnold Schoenberg talked about this in one of the books Aaron likes to read a lot. If you guys ever get a chance, those who are listening out here, read this book called Structural Functions of Harmony. Right, Aaron?
Yep.
I got to shoot out the old nod to that. It's a really small book, but it's really dense too with information. But there's a lot of good insights, I think, into how teachers of music can kind of treat what we're talking about. Well, anyway, the one thing he said that composers do is they invent melody and harmony at the same time. So it's not just a matter of writing a bass line and then writing a melody over the top of it. And it's not just the reverse process. Actually, it's together. Now, I'm not that good. I cannot do that. I cannot, audiate that well. It would be nice, but yeah, I think it's really cool that you can sit. For me, it's liberating. You can sit with a piece of paper on a plane or in a car, or as look out your window and imagine a certain melody line and actually put it to paper and kind of write it down. And that, in a lot of ways, I think frees up that kind of stuff.
It gets you out of your patterns.
Well,
absolutely. Yeah.
I think that's extremely important for anybody who's listening, is to be able to step away from your primary instrument and be able to come up with an idea and implement it, whether that's on an airplane and just writing it down and being able to hear those things in your head, or if you're a guitar player, walk over to the piano and actually create something on the piano. Even go into something like Fruity Loops or any of these programs that you can play on the computer and just kind of click and make your own type of thing. Because what's going to happen is you're going to find yourself being pushed in different directions. You're not limited to what you already know, the information of a pattern or something that already know on a guitar. You're going to find that what you create on paper or on piano or within a computer program, and then when you actually take that back to your primary instrument, the guitar, you're going to find it's like, wow, I would have never ever written something like that, ever. I would have never written something like that. And that's just the coolest thing, to be able to say, I wrote something that was not on my primary instrument, and it ended up being something that is just way cooler than I ever would have thought that I would have been able to do.
I would never want to sit here and take our art and break it down to pure science, because I think, in some ways there's something beautiful about what we do as composers. But if you think about everything we're talking about, it's how we process information that we hear. That's all it gets down to, right? So as you said, if you want to break out of those patterns, we'll process the information differently. How do we do that? There's nothing wrong with a program like Fruity Loops, or even getting into, I remember one time I was writing some stuff I thought I wanted to use in game audio, right? Video game audio. So what I did, I opened up Pro Tools. I went into the whatever they call piano roll or something, where you plug the notes in. I just literally started sequencing things, guiding myself what I knew a little bit in harmony, hit play, and with a few little, tweaks here or there, I had a whole composition. I'm like, holy shit, how did that happen? And if I went to play that and orchestrate it in a band, it would even be better. because then I can play with it and do it in the instrumentation. So again, it's how we're processing what we're hearing. And it took me a long time to get away from the guitar for that. So now when I hear guys come up to me and like, it happened not too long ago where someone said, hey, if you played over this chord, what scale shape would you use? I'm like, oh, don't go there. Don't go there. Change your line of thinking. Listen to what that harmony is suggesting and try some different things around it.
It's actually funny you say that, because I was thinking about this the other day. Did theory and learning theory ruin music for you?
For me? No, just the opposite.
No. And I understand what you're saying. I get that. That's the initial response. But before I knew theory, before I knew how the innards of it work, now I'm so glad that I the other side of the tracks and being able to know theory is extremely important. But before I knew theory, I heard things in a much different way, kind of like what we're talking about, where I got into this habit of I knew what the rules were, so I followed those rules. And if I broke those rules, I know that I was breaking those rules. But before all of that, it was just up to my ear. I would hear a chord set, and I didn't really matter any of the rules that were out there. I just kind of followed my ear, and what sounded good to me because of all the influences that I had through musicals or Broadway shows or radio or anything like that. I heard all these different kind of ways that people were composing, and I applied that to my ear and to my chord sets, and I made things the way I heard them. And then I sit here now and I sit there, okay, well, what is the theory behind it, and why did that work, and why was I hearing the things that I was hearing?
You're processing it differently. I think it goes right back to that. So, I don't think theory ruined anything for me personally. I mean, you got to remember something too. The words scare people. Theory for me is just a labeling process of what we already know. Our ears are fast. Our ears are quick. We can process information really intensely. Learning new ways of hearing harmony, I don't think is really a bad thing. It just broadens our musical vocabulary. The minute we start putting minor this, sus this, ninth this, for me, when I think of it now, I don't think theoretically. I think those are just concepts for me. So if I say, how does a major ninth chord work? Well, it's a colored harmony. It doesn't have any resolution property. It just colors the original harmony. So for me, there's no danger in learning that stuff. Yeah, I may hear things differently now, but in a good way. But here's something to kind of really think about how this works too. Hendrix, before he died, okay, somebody asked him, I forget who the interviewer was, said, Jimmy, if there's one style of music you can learn or something, what would you do? What would you explore more? He goes, I'd like to learn a little bit more about that 12-tone stuff. So had he lived, he probably would have been messing with like 12-tone row and chromaticism.
Yeah.
Really? That would be amazing, because everything he did was primarily, bluesy pentatonic stuff. I mean, if you want to get technical, let's go ahead and just hit this for like a second or two. Everything in pentatonic really misses the tritone, which is all your resolution power, right? The fourth and the seventh is absent from the pentatonic mode, right? So because of that, we have that whole, I don't want to call it bland, but we have a really homogenized, scalar system that we're kind of running in. And Jimmy did all of that. He was a master, a genius at knowing how to do inflections within a really kind of homogenized scale system. Now imagine him throwing in 12-tone. How does that change it? It changes everything. For him. It's learning a whole new system. So it's not theory for me. I think that would change. It just changes your ear. It changes how your ear processes information. But there's a part of what you're saying, I think, that I agree with too, which is the fact that, before I learned about all this stuff, for me, it was gut instinct.
Right.
And there was something kind of innocent and cool about just knowing the instinctual moves, right? And once you learn it, right, there was a period in my theoretical life where it's like, okay, well, I'm hearing this come in. This is obviously this minor harmony. I know this kind of moves to this kind of harmony. I can't go to the 6 yet because I have to move through the 5 first. And we don't have to go to that degree. I think that's just there to label and kind of, give a naming system to what happens in music. But, even the great composers experimented. Bach was one. Bach, they say he mastered counterpoint, but he was experimenting with counterpoint. He wasn't really labeling. Good case in point too. You guys know figured bass, the idea of the figured bass. That was not around, when figured bass was being practiced. That was what academicians put as a label centuries later. I want figure-based people. Harpsichordists are just saying, here's my bass line. I can put these over these bass lines and create these interesting harmonies. Later we label them as 6/4 or 6-chord or something like that. So I think for those that are coming up now that are afraid of theory, don't be afraid of theory. Just don't think of it as theory. Just don't think of it as, redefine it for yourself. Think of it as learning harmony, and how harmony works.
The language of music. I mean,
yeah, learn as a language. Yeah, sure. And break the rules. If look, if you don't want to go from a 5-chord to the 1-chord, don't do it. The Beatles broke that, right? I mean, they were moved from 4 to 1. They're using sort of I forget what they call it, the plagal cadence. I think is what it's called.
Church cadence.
Church cadence. Yeah, they were using that. They were not resolving off the dominant. They were resolving off the 4. Sounds great. Or how about, the Police, what they were doing. And this is more rhythm. And there's another thing, too. We're talking harmonies right now. We can't devalue rhythm. We have to learn rhythms. We have to learn how rhythms work. Because in some way, it's everything. It gives us the engine.
I tell my students it's the other half.
It's the other half of the equation, right. And the Police came in. And what were the Police doing? They were changing rhythmic accents, from what was currently being used in the time. So rules are made to be broken. But I think the minute we stop looking at them as a rule, I think learning theory becomes very enjoyable. I mean, for me, I am the other way. I'm a theorist. So I love knowing like the minutia of how harmonies work. But I don't think it's something we have to go out and buy theory books and study them to that degree anymore. I mean, there's a lot to be said for putting a record on and trying to figure out why certain changes are happening in certain ways.
I want to say, I don't think all theory is equal. I think there's a lot of theory that is incredibly useful and fascinating. And then I think back to things in my theory classes that I don't think are very useful for my students. And I avoid them for a while teaching them. I mean,
can you give an example?
Figured bass really to me is not something I feel like I need. I learned about it.
Yeah, but that was tablature for harpsichordists in the Baroque period. So in a way, right? So we don't need it anymore.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. You can spend all this time. People will be like, "Oh, I don't want to get into that." Well, maybe they shouldn't, because that's not going to necessarily make their playing better. It could, but probably not. Whereas if they spend their time learning the notes, root third, fifth in a chord, minor chord's got a flat third. Let's start adding sevenths. Let's start adding ninths, 11ths, 13ths. That sort of theory, I think, goes a lot farther at the beginning.
Of course.
In terms of making people feel like they've got something they can sit down and they can put it to use and find enjoyment out of it very quickly. And maybe write a song that's better than what they would have written had they not learned that theory.
Well, not to redirect the ship a little bit, because I know we need to kind of stay on track here a little bit. But just since you talked about it, what about teaching tab? It seems to be another kind of huge debate today. Should we teach musical notation? Here's my take on it. Notation is a mnemonic device for your ear. So who cares? I get into all these debates with teachers all the time. You're not teaching your students standard notation. It's called standard notation because it's standard practice in this little kind of echelon of Western music. For guitar players, tablature is another notation, and both function the same way. They are reminders for what your ear can pick up on and how we process what we're hearing. So for all those guys out there today that hopefully are listening to this, and you guys who are jamming the tabs are fine.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with it.
Yeah, as long as you learn standard notation with it.
Well, really, if you're going to become a composer and you're going to learn other instruments, fine. But this is what I'm kind of getting back to. Who cares if what's on the line is represented numerical value or like a little circle with a stem? Well, as long as you understand what that represents rhythmically musically.
I agree with you. I agree with you. But my problem is that most people go to a certain website and they look up those tabs. And unfortunately, with that specific website, there's never any rhythmic notation to it. So the majority of people out there will look at a tab and they just kind of associate that with a number, and there's no rhythmic value to it. That's where I have a problem with tabs specifically, is because I want them to understand that there's a rhythmic value behind it and there's an actual quality to it. I also like standard notation because it's a visual and they can see the rise and the fall of the musical line.
Sure.
If a student never, ever looks at standard notation, they can't grasp that as well. So I do agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying, but I do think that if you're going to teach tab, you absolutely must have some idea of what the standard staff is about.
Oh yeah, there's no question. You're right. There are ways, though, I think, in tablature to remedy all those ideas and to make sure we insert rhythmic value and other, because it's really just another notation system. So, I'm not the best sight reader in the world. I mean, I really wish I could be like these guys that get the chart and kind of read it. I mean, my studio work has always been, let me see chord charts. Okay, give me a sketch, give me a schematic of the harmonies, let me see them, and then let me play. Right. And I can kind of process that way. I know other musicians can kind of look at a score and they can play it beautifully. The hard part I've always had with standard notation was learning how to interpret that to make it more internal for me. And I found the tab is just another version of that in some ways. But you're right. There are a lot of websites out there that is draw 6 lines, let's write the numbers down, and hopefully we'll get the lick. Right. Well, no, we need more information available. But as far as a system, I don't think there's anything wrong with tablature. It would be like saying to the harpsichordists of the Baroque period, you guys are playing that figured bass stuff. You should be reading standard notation. It's better. No, for their instrument, figured bass was the method and how it kind of works. So who cares? And it's just I think it's a cultural conditioning, I think, right now about guitar players. And again, going back to this thing that guitar players have this, sort of stigma that we play by ear. And because we play by ear, we don't know anything about music. Think about that for a minute. How many times have you heard that? Oh, you're a guitar player? Okay, you're not really a musician because you don't really read, Well, that's bullshit too, right? So I think there's a lot of value to guitar players. Scott Henderson talked about this in an interview he did with Jeff Berlin. I think when they were doing one of their tours, when it was with a trio, you had Jeff on one side saying, got to read standard notation, you got to do it. And Scott's like, I don't know if I agree with that. I think, playing by your ear is got a lot of merit. So it's a neat kind of debate, and I sit on the side of using instinct, and using how we process auditorily as opposed to reading. So there it is. I'll probably get a lot of email back.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Bring it.
The more the merrier, right?
Okay, so back to the tab thing. I think that the tab is an excellent tool, but I think that as a community of guitarists, I think we could improve tab. I think we could elevate it by putting more information into it as a standard. I mean, I like my system for teaching. I always I'll put a box around the root, I'll put a diamond around the third, a circle around the fifth, and a triangle around the seventh.
That's great.
The seventh is the leading tone. And so what that does, I do that in standard notation and in tablature. And I think that if you're on the guitar, if you're reading tab and you see that that's the root, I mean, maybe it's the 7th fret of the D string. When you see that there's a box around that, you realize that's the root. It helps you to get the same information you would have gotten out of standard notation.
Agreed.
And yes, you could start to put rhythmic values in just like you do. I mean, sometimes some books and things actually do that.
They do.
Putting stems on the tab and
like magazines will do it. Yeah, absolutely. But I'm saying
that everywhere.
The majority of people go to, usually there's one website out there that most people go to, and that website doesn't have any of that. And that's where almost everybody gets their information from. But your system, Joe, of being able to actually write that out and maybe even color code it, that gives that new guitar player or an existing guitar player that information, and that information is so important for them to be able to identify the root, the third, the fifth, and the seventh, an understanding of that when they're playing. Yes, they may be doing their tablature and running along, because I do really like tablature, especially from the beginning, because standard notation takes a while to get down and memorize, and being able to understand where all those notes are on the fretboard and being able to apply that. But with a tablature approach, kids can get up and running really quick, and that's extremely important because that keeps that motivation. They just want to play. So standard notation is extremely important, as tablature. I mean, it gets them up and moving and motivated. That's so important. But like you were saying, I think if there was a standard that was kind of implemented across the board with more information, that would just be so much better, because now the guitarists in the community would have a better understanding of what harmony is and how to be able to create a leading tone and all that goes with it. I think that's just so important.
Yeah, and I've been in those situations where I've been playing gigs with other musicians, and yeah, I mean, I love tab, but I understand about the innards of rhythm and harmony and stuff, and I get into those situations and talk to another musician with the same language and say, "What are you playing over there? A minor? Okay, well, that gives me a lot of information. I know what I can do." And kind of speak with them in that way. They're never going to look at my stuff and say, "Oh, well, you're reading off a tab sheet, so you don't know what you're doing." But there's a lot, you got to understand too, especially for guitar players who are just up and coming. If you take an E on the bottom line of your staff, that E is represented in 3 different positions on the guitar, right? 3 different strings, So in, classical sheet music, Spanish guitar sheet music, they make other notation representations about where the positions go. Okay. All right. Well, fine. You're just adding more information to an already existing standard notation. So like Joe said, we take a tab, take its beginnings, right, its fundamentals, and keep adding information to make it more clear to what guitar players have. I think there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that.
No.
Goes back to what we were saying last week about our ultimate goal of getting people to stay motivated. And you just said it too, Aaron, but a lot of the time, if you don't get somebody up and playing something quickly and having a good time, that is at its core, the purpose of music is enjoyment and expression. And, that is what we want to get most of our students. That's the direction we want them to go. And if they learn to love it that much, then maybe they'll take it to another level. Well,
and like you guys said too, it's a motivation killer if you struggle trying to produce music in the early stages of your playing, right? If you're struggling so, I mean, it's one of the reasons why I jettisoned the instruction books in my youth, and look, there's a lot of valuable stuff there looking back as a man now. But like when I was 8 years old, going through the Mel Bay methods, I'm like, oh, why am I playing Mary Had a Little Lamb? Why am I doing this? This is not fun. And whether it's effective or not, the result was I quit for like a year until I started teaching myself. And then I was playing Metallica, and I was like, this is cool. And that was the catalyst for everything else.
Yeah.
Everything else. I mean, musically, I grew from those roots of like putting cassettes in, right, into the old tape decks. And yeah, the cassettes used to run fast, like a quarter step. So I always had to like detune or retune my guitar a little bit. Remember that? And try to slow down. But there was so much ear training in those early days that I got tremendously. I never would have got from books. Never.
I remember being 6 years old, sitting down with my first little, I don't remember what they were called. There was a little tape recorder about yay big. It was brown, had big brown buttons. And I remember sitting there with Moonlight Sonata and my piano and learning the whole freaking thing from ear because it motivated me. It was something that I really wanted to do. I heard the arpeggios and I heard the harmonies, and I was like, this is where it's at. I don't care about books. I want to actually be able to kind of immerse myself in this song and be able to figure it out and apply it. And that was it. It was all about that kind of getting into it. That was the exciting part. Same thing with guitar. Same story for me was, I as soon as I picked up Metallica's One, it was all over from there.
Actually, my first tune I ever learned was Heaven and Hell by Black Sabbath. That was the first. Actually, that's not true. La Bamba was first.
Right.
And then I quickly realized that Sabbath was cooler. So then I played, so Heaven and Hell, actually it was Neon Nights was the first riff, and then Heaven and Hell was later. But, just thinking of like those riffs and putting them together, like, wow, like I'm actually owning this now. Mm-hmm. And the rest was history. And then I found it became more ownership for me to learn theory, to learn music, because I wanted to understand how that stuff was created. And for me, that was much better. And I think, maybe this is kind of for me a way to prove that learning music is got to be an organic thing. I think if a teacher had sat me down with a book in those early days, like 8, 9, or 10, and saying, "Here, open this up, learn this song," I wouldn't have done it. I wouldn't have done it. There would have been very little motivation. That translation. So it was always hard for me, even in sight reading. Okay, what's that note? Oh, I got to play that here. Bang. What's that note? Here. Bang. what am I doing? This is, it had to be, for me, it had to be learning this first and then looking at the notation as a mnemonic to remember how this worked. And that's how I've always operated. And then from here, I get a lot of information in my ears too. So it's always been that kind of inner process for me of learning. And notation was always just there as like what do you want to call it? A chart, a memory aid.
Right.
Yeah. I want to go back to the learning music as a whole rather than focusing on the guitar specifically. I think one thing that we've alluded to it a little bit, but I think that rhythm and percussion instruments is something I think that everybody should play percussion. I think that it's invaluable when you get into a group setting. If you have played the drums, you don't have to be a great drummer able to do incredible fills or anything, but if you've done that, your internal sense of rhythm will get a lot better. When you sit down with the band, you're going to be a much better player if you've had that rhythmic experience. And then on the other side of that, when you're actually playing the guitar, you can take one note and change the rhythm that you're playing that one note. That's one of my favorite exercises to do with a little kid. I'll give them like one note to start, like where you're playing. I don't need to give them the whole A minor pentatonic scale. I'll give them the A and tell them that all they can play is the A, but they have to play the coolest solo. And so it's like, at first they just want to go A, 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 A. And I'm like, no, you can go like A, 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 A. And you can make something cool with that. Then you start adding, I'll give them two notes and let them play a solo with just the A and the C, or the A and the G. And so I think that having that percussion experience kind of and training your mind to think rhythmically about things rather than having to play flurries of notes, you can do something. I mean, that's why funk music is so cool. It's all about rhythm.
Yeah. There's a great documentary out I just watched called Word is Bond. If you guys get a chance, look at this. It's basically the history of, well, I don't want to say history, but it's like a documentary about hip hop and how hip hop artists through the ages have come up. And there was one segment they did. I never knew this. I was blown away. Hip hop artists actually will write their lyrics on a notepad, and underneath certain syllables of words, they put dots and like dashes and things, almost like Morse code a little bit, to signify the rhythms and how the rhythms work. I mean, so there you go. You have a whole other medium, right? And even notationally, that are conveying musical ideas, and they're learning and they're interpreting rhythmically. And I think if you want to go ahead and say rhythm is melody, I'll argue that. I think rhythm is a type of melody in a sense, right? And it's a type of musical phrasing that we kind of see. And I mean, let's face it. I mean, there's a lot of great hip hop stuff out there because the rhythms work, and the rhythms are so intuitive and they work really, really well. So yeah, I think it's imperative that we teach our students, how to flex rhythm. I mean, think about this, right? Poets. I teach a lot of poetry to my students too. It's all rhythmic. I mean, even the way we're talking right now. Natural conversation. Here we go. It's all rhythmic, right? So why not teach those kinds of things? And creatively do these exercises with their students. I mean, I never cite this stuff we talk about in books anywhere. Books are more relegated for the theoretical information, which I think is valuable at a certain point, right? But I think we need to get more creative in how we approach this.
One thing that I find all the time with almost every single student that I tell to try to, in terms of rhythm, to speak it out, or how are we going to count this? Can you actually tell me how this is counted? And I want to actually verbally hear this. Anytime I approach a student, they always tell me I can do it in my head. Or if they have a problem, if they end up tripping up, I can do it in my head. And I'm like, no, that for me is unacceptable. I need to actually be able to verbally hear you speak it. That way you go through the actual motion of understanding out loud what a rhythm is and its value. Because most often we kind of make it this excuse in our head of, it makes sense in my head. And it's like, yeah, I'm going to call your bluff on that because I don't think you can. And most often, even me, I used to do the same exact thing. But it wasn't until I went through that actual process of being able to actually physically go through the process of saying, okay, I'm going to take this measure and I'm going to make sure it's right. Because I think that with every single person over the years, I've found that there are probably 4 or 5 rhythms that we are all accustomed to. It's what we go back to. It's our home plate. And whether it's this song or that song that we're learning and we come across a certain measure that we're not used to, we're most likely gonna just kind of, I'll just kind of go over that and I'll do my own rhythm to it. And it'll be something like it. It'll be close enough. That's cool. And what I tell my students is like, that's only going to get you so far. And you're only really doing yourself a disservice. If you learn rhythms that you are not accustomed to, you are now incorporating more tools into your toolbox that later on you can actually bring out those tools in different rhythms that you may not be used to. The longer that you fight this process of, I'm just going to do my own thing and I'm going to make it my own, which I did for years. It didn't matter what song it was. If I came across something, because I relied on my ear, if I came across something that was a little bit awkward for me, I would just be like, you know what? I'm just going to do this and no one will really notice. And is anybody going to really notice? No, but I really, truly believe that you're doing yourself a disservice. You're going to gain so much more if you just take bits and pieces from different artists. You're going through that process anyway. If you take bits and pieces from different artists and learn their nuances, you're going to be able to kind of build up this repertoire of all these new ideas and licks and ways to approach things. If you go through that process, it's so important to be able to look at a rhythm and be able to say, okay, it might take me the next 5 minutes to be able to actually clap this out or be able to tap it out on something. That process is so important, but I get all the time. Nah, I've got it in my head. I got it. I can do it. Yeah. It's like, no, you can't.
Well, I'm kind of watching the time here, but I want to just real fast. Ginger Baker, right? Cream, the drummer. When he was younger, he used to hang out with Phil Seaman, another amazing jazz drummer. They'd hang out in a basement, and Phil would put on records of African rhythms. And Ginger's like, holy shit, what is this? And he'd go back and incorporate them in his drum patterns. Nobody knew, but it expanded his ability, his toolbox to infuse new things. And look at what he did, in the drum industry there.
Yeah,
too.
Pioneer.
Awesome. I hope you guys check us out. If you have any comments, leave them below. We'll start a conversation. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you next week at the same time. Have a good one. Cheers.
Natural conversation. Here we go.
This will be one of those moments we edit out later.